Chapter 5. Lily White makes the worst mistake of her life. In the morning light, dozens of heavy feet marched in unison, their steps weighed down by the great loads their owners carried on their backs. Steel clanked against steel, gold rattled in bags, and mead and ale sloshed against their bottles. Grunts of sustained effort could be heard amidst belches escaping from thickly bearded mouths. Marching in triple file, heavily armored, bloodied and battle-weary, were the stoutest of all creatures, dwarves. As dwarves tend to be, the dwarves were as tall as children, but firm and strong, with great bushy beards and rather round bellies. They carried all sorts of items in their arms and in large packs, ranging from food to pelts to treasure to women's clothing. A single dwarf strutted apart and ahead of the rest. He was a bit shorter than most of the other dwarves, with a long, pointy nose and a look of supreme confidence. He wasn't carrying anything, despite the large burdens on backs of the other dwarves. Another dwarf, who shouldered a large pack despite also having to propel himself in a wooden wheelchair on the dirt trail, called out to the unencumbered dwarf and said,
"Hey, Tricky, why don't you have to carry anything?"
"Because, Stumpy, if you hadn't noticed, I was the one who masterminded this whole raid. You can thank me for these piles of treasure. Course, when we get back, you'll have to hand them all over to me to make sure everyone gets their fair share."
"Oh," whined a dwarf with a thick voice who looked rather like a sphere with a beard.
"Last time we did that, my pile was smaller than everyone else's."
"That's because, my dear Paunchy,"
said Tricky, sounding like he was explaining something to a child,
"you ate so much of the treasure. You're lucky you got anything at all."
Paunchy looked ready to complain some more, but Tricky cut him off.
"All right, boys,"
called Tricky, turning now to face the column of dwarves.
"Enough talk. Time for a victory song."
The dwarves cheered. Singy, the most musical of the dwarves, started them off, soon joined in by all the rest in their deep, booming voices. "Oh No," sung to the tune of a song we are not allowed to mention, because of copyright owned by the Walt Disney Corporation.
We kill everyone in town. We burn the village down.
It's an easy deal to get a meal.
If you go and steal anything you feel
From the town,
Where there's 1,000 people around.
we killed everyone around. We burned every house we found.
It is ideal when the bells all peal, and they reel from our cold hard steel.
In the town,
Where we steal gold by the pound.
"Oh no,"
called one dwarf.
"Oh no,"
called another dwarf.
"Oh no,
Oh no!
Oh no, oh no, we stole somebody's gold.
We beat his wife.
we killed his cat.
Oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no.
We're awesome and we're bold.
The dwarven life is great all told.
Oh no, oh no.
After some whistling, this and other such unbearable nonsense continued through the remainder of the dwarves' march. Finally, as the evening wore on and turned to night, the dwarves reached their beloved home, the dilapidated house in the woods. It was immediately clear that something was wrong. Stumpy was the first to call out.
My ramp's gone. How am I supposed to get inside?
I smell something,
said Sniffy.
There's smoke,
said Pointy, pointing to a mound of smoke that was rising behind the house. The dwarves broke ranks and ran to the back of the house, where a large bonfire was burning fiercely.
My ramp!
Yelled Stumpy.
Pull it out!
My socks!
Yelled Nasty, a dwarf with an especially unkempt beard, long yellow fingernails, and gnarled dark teeth. My mattress! Yelled Dumpy, a seemingly normal dwarf. Hell hath no fury like a horde of angry dwarves. They stormed into the house in a rage, looking for whoever had invaded their home. After some searching, one of the dwarves, Lumpy, went to his bed and saw a woman curled up in a fresh set of sheets and blankets. Her hair was pinned up, and her face was so pale that it reflected the moonlight brilliantly. Lumpy's anger dissolved immediately. He carefully crawled onto the bed and snuggled up to the sleeping Lily White. Lily White, still with her eyes closed, rolled over and put an arm lovingly around the hairy dwarf so that they were face to face. Lumpy tried to stifle his gleeful giggles, but a few broke through. Lily White's eyes fluttered open, and she stared happily and sleepily into the dwarf's eyes. Her face quickly changed to confusion, puzzlement, and then fear. She screamed. Lumpy put his finger to his lips in a shushing signal, but Lily White wouldn't have it. She jumped out of the bed. Dwarves ran and gathered to the scream. Lily White made to run away, but the dwarves were too quick. A gang of the dwarves surrounded her, then lunged and grabbed at her limbs. Lily White screamed again.
Ew, get away, you nasty dwarves! You're not my prince!
The dwarves carried her over to the ladder that led to the main level of the house, and tossed her to a few dwarves who stood waiting there. They dragged her into the front room of the house and threw her in a heap at Tricky's feet. It was a sight to see, all of those dwarves stomping their feet and cracking their knuckles.
Quiet, quiet,
Tricky ordered. The dwarves hushed, though they bobbed back and forth in fury. Lily White had risen back to her feet, her face scrunched in anger, and her hands busied with fixing her hair.
What are you doing in our house?
Demanded Tricky.
Your house?
Asked Lily White.
Yeah, our house,
said Tricky.
You know, where we live?
No.
Said Lily White.
There's no way anyone lived here. This place must have been abandoned for years.
Well, it ain't abandoned,
said Tricky.
We live here. Us, the dwarves.
Lily White looked around the room, quickly taking stock of her situation. The dwarves looked like a pack of wolves that had cornered their prey. The anger fell from Lily White's face as she gulped.
Well, I guess I'll just be leaving then,
said Lily White with excessive confidence as she made a step toward the door. Stumpy, who must have been carried into the house, rolled forward and raised up an axe in his hands, saying,
Not before you pay for my ramp.
A clean-shaven dwarf ran out in front of Stumpy's wheelchair of death.
Stop,
said the dwarf.
You can't kill her. She's a woman.
What are you talking about, Nicey?
Said Stumpy.
We kill women all the time.
But not once is beautiful, called out a wide-eyed dwarf named Lovey.
She's not beautiful,
said Nasty in a high-pitched voice, pointing at her with one of his long yellow fingernails.
Her skin is sickly pale.
Oh, but she does have a great bod,
said Lusty. The dwarves nodded and muttered in agreement.
Oh, please don't hurt me,
said Lily White imploringly.
I'm just a nice girl. I went to town to buy my grandmother some medicine. Then the rabbit said mean things about her, and some crazy guy attacked me. And Mr. Beetle wouldn't even listen. His guts just got all over my bag. He's almost worse than Mr. Bunny.
There was an awkward silence as the dwarves with furrowed brows looked to each other for some kind of explanation of Lily White's nonsense.
Hey,
said Tricky at length to Lily White.
Give us a minute, huh?
Motioning to the dwarves, he called a dwarf huddle. A few stayed out to guard Lily White from escape.
Okay, boys, said Tricky in a whisper. Look, this girl's bonkers, but I think I've got a plan.
What you gonna do?
asked Paunchy through the hamburger in his mouth.
You'll see, said Tricky. Just follow along.
The dwarves nodded in agreement, broke the huddle, and faced Lily White.
I think, said Tricky, that we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. What's your name?
Lily White,
said the girl.
Uh-huh,
said Tricky.
Well, my name's Tricky. That's Stumpy.
Stumpy shook his axe threateningly.
And there's Paunchy.
The beach ball dwarf smiled and belched.
Here's my little pal Bumpy.
The smallest dwarf tried to wave hello, but smacked against a table in the process and fell down.
And don't forget Nasty.
This was unnecessary, as no one could ever forget Nasty, if for nothing else than for his smell. Tricky introduced many more dwarves than Lily White could ever remember, including Funky, Tasty, Jelly, Rhymy, and Flirty. After a very long time, introductions were completed, and the conversation was taken to the large, filthy dining room table. Tricky motioned for Lily White to sit first, on a bench against the wall, and she was immediately hemmed in on both sides by dwarves, trapped. Mugs of mead were passed around the table, which lightened the dwarves' moods considerably. Lily White smelled some and almost fainted.
You know, Lily White,
began Tricky,
I think I like you after all. And, if you like, you could stay here for a while, until you work out your life.
Lily White looked alarmed.
Oh,
She stammered.
That's ever so kind, but I need to get home to bring grandmother her medicine. I mean, your home is very, nice?
She trailed off.
Well, if you're so busy,
said Stumpy angrily,
then why have you been hanging around here and ruining our house?
As I said before,
said Lily White.
I was attacked by a crazy man in the forest and couldn't find my way back to the road, so I thought I'd stay here for a few days.
But see, that's the point, isn't it?
Said Tricky, rubbing his hands together.
This crazy dude ain't gonna come here, is he? Everyone around here knows that if they come to this house, they will kill him. Or worse.
He laughed, and so did many other dwarves.
So you see, continued Tricky, we can keep you safe.
And what about my grandmother's medicine?
Asked Lily White.
Oh,
said Tricky with a dismissive wave of his hand.
"We could take care of that, no problem. You just tell us what to get, and I'll send Fetchy to deliver it for you, dear sweet Granny. He'll even make up a nice little bow. Isn't that right, Fetchy?"
A dwarf with running shorts nodded affirmative.
Well, gosh,
Said Lily White.
that would be wonderful. But this house...
"I know this place is a little rough,"
Said Tricky knowingly.
"but I think all it might need is a woman's touch."
Lily White eyed the dwarves, who had varying levels of lust and rage on their faces.
"Oh,"
Said Tricky.
"don't you worry about these guys. They're perfect gentlemen. Right, boys?"
A few dwarves, including Nicey, replied, "Right!" Most didn't say anything. Lily White relaxed.
Well,
Said Lily White, nodding slowly to herself.
I think this might work.
"Yeah, it would work,"
Said Tricky.
"So let's just get that signed in black and white and make it all official, why don't we?"
A contract?
Asked Lily White.
"More of an agreement,"
Said Tricky shrewdly.
Well, I guess that would be okay.
Said Lily White. Tricky went into action at this point, dashing to the office and returning with a sheet of parchment and a pen. Tricky dipped the pen in his mouth for a moment and then began scratching words down.
"We, the dwarves,"
Tricky said aloud as he wrote,
"being of one mind and multiple body, do hereby agree to rent a room or other space as can be found to Lily White, and provide her with protection as deemed necessary by the head dwarf, and procure product of medicinal nature such as would be useful to Lily White's granny. In exchange, Lily White agrees to the following terms."
He looked across the table at Lily White and smiled in what was clearly meant to be a fatherly smile, though it made him look rather menacing. His beakish nose didn't help.
"I think we can agree,"
Said Tricky.
"that some minor housekeeping might be in order."
Oh, yes, of course.
Said Lily White.
I've already been doing that anyway.
She pointed out cheerfully, oblivious to Stumpy's furious glare. Tricky scratched down the claws.
"And a bit of cooking?"
That'd be fine.
Said Lily White.
"And maybe,"
Said Tricky as he wrote that down too,
"putting some money towards rent now and then. You know, whatever you're able to pay."
That seems fair.
Said Lily White, nodding with glee.
Oh, I'm just so happy that you're going to let me stay.
"Oh, believe me,"
Said Tricky.
"we're excited too."
Tricky added a few notes and passed the contract to Lily White.
"Well, all right then,"
Said Tricky.
"just go ahead and sign this here at the bottom."
Lily White glanced down at the contract and signed it with a flourish.
My grandmother taught me how to write.
Said Lily White, beaming.
"That's great,"
Said Tricky in a voice he might have used on a baby.
"Now, it's been a long day, and I'm sure you'd like to get some rest."
Oh, yes.
Said Lily White with a stretch and a wide yawn.
"Well, then go ahead, dear. Sleep tight. Don't let Pinchy pinch or Bitey bite."
Lily White laughed, but none of the dwarfs did. One had a sly smile on his face and immediately pinched her rump.
Ow! Knock that off!
Cried Lily White, slapping Pinchy's hand. But before she could complain further, a crew of dwarves rushed her off to bed. Once he was sure that Lily White was out of hearing range, Tricky dropped his falsely sweet smile and replaced it with a much more genuine and greedy grin. Tricky rubbed his hands together and then unfolded a hidden section of the contract, revealing a large gap of blank contract beneath the agreed-on contract terms and above Lily White's signature.
All right, boys. With this blank space here, we can add whatever we want. Let's take this girl for all she's worth.
I see she's got to bathe Stinky, said a dwarf.
Oh, yeah,
said Tricky heartily.
She'll bathe Stinky.
He scratched the extra clause into the contract.
She'll have to do all of the cleaning,
said Stumpy. Tricky nodded and added it.
I want nightly massages after a hard day of pillaging,
said Nasty. Tricky put it down. Hours into the night, the dwarves were still adding things to the contract. Tricky had to shoot down some of the cruder ideas offered by Flirty and Nasty. But finally, well after 2:00 a.m., Tricky folded up the contract and put it in a secret pocket of his coat for safekeeping. The dwarves hummed and skipped to their beds, excited about all of the wonderful things that Lily White would start doing the next day.